I'm Jack, a New York office worker who survived the first 48 hours of the technological apocalypse. One moment I was filing reports, the next our world went dark. No power, no phones, no way out of a 32-story building. Chaos erupted as millions fought for survival. This is how I made it through hell in America's largest city. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. Hey everyone, I'm Jack Thompson, and I'm here to tell you about how I survived the first 48 hours of what we're now calling the technological apocalypse. It's hard to believe that just a few days ago, I was living a completely normal life as an office worker in New York City. I want to share my story with you, not just because it's important to document what happened, but because I hope it might help someone else out there who's trying to make sense of this new world we're living in. Let me take you back to that day. It was a Tuesday, July 15th, 2025. I remember it clearly because it was supposed to be a big day for our company. We were finalizing a major deal and everyone was buzzing with excitement. I woke up at 6:30 just like any other weekday. My alarm went off and I groggily reached for my phone to check my emails and the news. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary then. I went through my usual morning routine: shower, coffee, a quick breakfast while scrolling through social media. Looking back, I wish I'd paid more attention to the little things, savored that last normal morning a bit more. But hindsight is 20/20, right? I left my apartment at 7:45, joining the sea of commuters flooding into the subway station. The train was packed as usual, everyone either staring at their phones or avoiding eye contact. I managed to squeeze in and grab onto a handrail, pulling out my own phone to pass the time. That's when I first noticed something odd. My news app was filled with articles about unusual solar activity. Scientists were reporting some kind of massive solar flare, bigger than anything they'd seen before, but it was buried under celebrity gossip and political drama, so I didn't think much of it. I mean, how many times have we heard about some potential disaster that never materialized, right? I arrived at the office just before 9, riding the elevator up to the 32nd floor. Our offices had floor-to-ceiling windows with a breathtaking view of the city. I remember pausing for a moment to look out at the skyline, all those buildings reaching up to the clouds, the streets below teeming with life. It's an image that's seared into my memory now. The morning was a whirlwind of meetings and phone calls. Everyone was focused on the big deal we were closing. I was in the middle of a video conference with our West Coast office when it happened. It was 2:27 in the afternoon. I know because I was looking at the clock on my computer screen when suddenly it went black. At first I thought it was just my computer crashing. Annoying, but not unusual. But then I heard confused voices from the conference room next door. I stood up and looked around. Every screen in the office was dark. The overhead lights had gone out too, leaving us in the dim glow of the afternoon sun filtering through the windows. There was a moment of confused silence and then everyone started talking at once. People were pulling out their phones, but they weren't working either. No signal, no data. Nothing. That's when the first ripple of real fear went through the office. Our boss, Mr. Sanderson, came out of his office looking as confused as the rest of us. He tried to calm everyone down, saying it was probably just a power outage and that everything would be back up soon. But I could see the worry in his eyes. I went to the window, hoping to see what was happening in other buildings. What I saw made my blood run cold. As far as I could see, every building was dark. No lights, no flickering screens, nothing. And down on the streets, traffic had come to a standstill. Cars weren't moving and I could see people getting out, looking around in confusion. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just our building. This wasn't even just our block. Something big was happening. Something that affected the entire city. The next few minutes were chaos. People were trying to call their families, but no phones were working. Some were crying. Others were angry, demanding answers that no one had. Mr. Sanderson was trying to organize everyone, but it was like herding cats. I remember thinking about my family. My parents lived upstate, and my sister was traveling in Europe. Were they okay? Did this affect them too? The not knowing was almost worse than anything else. Someone suggested we try the emergency radio, but of course it was electric and wouldn't turn on. A few of us tried to access the internet through our phones or laptops, hoping to find some information, but nothing was working. It was like we'd been cut off from the rest of the world. As the initial shock wore off, people started to realize we needed to get out of the building. 32 floors up with no working elevators meant a long climb down the emergency stairs. Mr. Sanderson finally managed to get everyone's attention and started organizing us into groups to head down. I was in one of the first groups. We grabbed whatever we thought might be useful: flashlights, first aid kits, water bottles, and headed for the stairs. The stairwell was already getting crowded as people from other floors joined us. The descent was slow and tense. It was dark, with only the emergency lights providing dim illumination. People were scared, some were panicking. I heard someone a few flights up having an asthma attack. We had to stop several times to let people rest or to help someone who was struggling. As we got lower, we could hear sirens outside. It was a cacophony, like every emergency vehicle in the city was on the move. move. It didn't do much to calm our nerves. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached the ground floor. But stepping out onto the street was like entering another world. The New York I knew, always bustling with energy and noise, was gone. In its place was a scene of confusion and fear. Cars were stopped in the middle of the road. Some had crashed into each other. Traffic lights were out, causing gridlock at every intersection. People were everywhere, many looking lost and scared. I saw a group trying to push a car to the side of the road, probably to clear a path. The noise was overwhelming. Car alarms were blaring, people were shouting, and those sirens were still wailing in the distance. And underneath it all was an eerie silence, the absence of the constant hum of electricity that we'd all grown so used to we didn't even notice it anymore. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. It was like something out of a movie, but this was real. This was happening. A police officer was trying to direct traffic at a nearby intersection. I overheard him telling someone that it wasn't just New York. Reports were coming in that this was happening all over the country, maybe even the world. My mind reeled at the implications. I knew I needed to get home, but home was on the other side of the city. With no subway and gridlocked streets, I realized I'd have to walk, so I started walking, joining the throngs of people all trying to figure out what to do next. As I walked, I saw scenes that I'll never forget. A group of people were huddled around a car, listening to its radio, one of the few sources of information still working. Store owners were locking up, afraid of looting. I passed a hospital where doctors and nurses were trying to evacuate patients. The sun was starting to set and a new fear gripped me. What would the city be like in the dark? I picked up my pace, weaving through the crowds, trying to get home before night fell. I was about halfway home when I heard a commotion ahead. A crowd had gathered around an electronics store. The windows were smashed and people were rushing in and out, grabbing whatever they could. I saw fights breaking out over laptops and phones that wouldn't even work. I skirted around the edge of the crowd, keeping my head down. That's when I bumped into someone. A young woman, couldn't have been more than 20. She looked terrified. "Do you know what's happening?" she asked me, her voice shaking. "I can't reach my mom. She needs her medication. I don't know what to do." I wish I could say I stopped to help her, but the truth is, I was scared too. I just mumbled something about trying to find a working phone and kept moving. It's not something I'm proud of, but fear makes you do things you never thought you would. As I got closer to my neighborhood, I started recognizing faces, neighbors, people I'd see at the local coffee shop or bodega. There was a sense of relief in seeing familiar faces, but also a shared fear. None of us knew what was going on or what to do. I finally reached my apartment building just as true darkness was falling. The city, usually so bright you could never see the stars, was plunging into a darkness I'd never experienced before. It was oppressive, almost suffocating. My apartment was on the 5th floor. Climbing those stairs in the dark, I felt a wave of exhaustion hit me. The events of the day, the fear, the uncertainty, it all came crashing down at once. I barely made it through my door before collapsing on the couch. I sat there in the dark, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The quiet was unnerving. No hum of the refrigerator, no distant sound of traffic, just silence, occasionally broken by a shout or a siren from outside. I knew I needed to do something, to prepare somehow, but I didn't know where to start. I found some candles and matches, giving myself a small circle of light. I turned on the faucet, relieved when water came out. At least we still had water pressure for now. As I sat there sipping a glass of water and trying to plan my next move, I couldn't help but think about how quickly everything had changed. Just that morning, my biggest worry had been closing a business deal. Now I was wondering if I'd have enough food to last through whatever this was. I decided to try and get some sleep, hoping that maybe I'd wake up and find out this had all been a bad dream. But as I lay in bed, listening to the unusual silence of the city, I knew that tomorrow would bring a whole new set of challenges. Little did I know just how challenging the next 24 hours would be. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. Every sound from outside made me jump, wondering if it was the start of something worse. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke up with a start around 3 in the morning. For a moment I forgot what had happened, reaching for my phone to check the time. The black screen brought it all rushing back. I got up and went to the window. The city was eerily dark, with only a few flickering lights here and there, probably candles or battery-powered lamps. In the distance, I could see the glow of what looked like fires. That sight sent a chill down my spine. I spent the rest of the night trying to come up with a plan. I took stock of what I had in my apartment, some canned food, a few bottles of water, a flashlight with extra batteries. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the first light of dawn broke, I made a decision. I needed to try and contact my family, and I needed more supplies. I'd have to venture out into the city again. I got dressed and packed a backpack with some essentials: water, a few granola bars, my flashlight, and a first aid kit. I also grabbed a baseball bat from my closet. I'd never used it for protection before, but something told me I might need it now. Before leaving, I tried to think of any way to communicate with my family. I wrote a note and taped it to my door, just in case they somehow made it here. It felt futile, but I had to do something. Stepping out into the hallway was surreal. It was completely silent, no sounds of TVs or music from other apartments. I knocked on my neighbor's door, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen. There was no answer. I hoped she was okay. okay or had family taking care of her. The stairwell was dark, and I had to use my flashlight to navigate down the 5 flights. When I reached the lobby, I paused, taking a deep breath before pushing open the door to the street. The scene outside was like nothing I'd ever seen. Cars were abandoned in the middle of the road, some with their doors still open. Trash was strewn everywhere, and there was broken glass from some storefronts that had been smashed. People were moving about, but not in the usual New York hustle. Everyone looked wary, moving quickly with purpose. I saw a few people carrying bags full of supplies, probably from looted stores. My first goal was to find a working phone or some way to communicate. I headed towards the nearest police station, hoping they might have some emergency communication system set up. As I walked, I saw more signs of how quickly things had deteriorated. A group of people were arguing over a cart of groceries outside a darkened supermarket. I saw others trying to siphon gas from cars. It was like the rules of society were already breaking down. I passed by an electronics store that had been completely ransacked. People were still picking through the remains, even though none of the devices would work. I guess they were hoping things would come back online soon. When I reached the police station, my heart sank. It was chaos. A crowd had gathered outside, all demanding answers and help. The few officers present looked overwhelmed and just as lost as everyone else. I managed to push my way through to one of the officers. When I asked about contacting people outside the city, he just shook his head. "We've got no communications, no electricity, nothing," he said. "We're as in the dark as you are, buddy." That's when the reality of the situation really hit me. We were cut off. No one was coming to help us, at least not anytime soon. We were on our own. I started to make my way back home, my mind racing with this new information. That's when I heard the first gunshot. It came from a few blocks away, but in the unusual quiet of the city, it sounded like it was right next to me. People around me panicked. Some ran, others ducked for cover. I pressed myself against a building, my heart pounding. More shots followed, then shouting. I couldn't tell if it was a fight over resources or something else, but I knew I didn't want to be anywhere near it. I took a different route home, trying to stick to side streets and alleys. That's when I ran into Mike, a guy from my building. He looked like he'd been through hell, his clothes dirty and torn. "Jack," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Man, am I glad to see a familiar face. Do you know what's going on?" I shook my head. "Not really. Seems like it's not just us, though. The whole city, maybe even further." Mike nodded grimly. "I heard some guys talking. They said it was some kind of solar flare or something. Fried all the electronics. Don't know if it's true, but it would explain a lot. A solar flare. It made sense, considering those news reports I'd seen just before everything went dark. But if it was true, the implications were staggering. How widespread was this? How long would it last? Mike and I decided to team up. Safety in numbers, we figured. We made our way to a small bodega on our block. The owner, Mr. Guzman, was there, guarding his store with a baseball bat. When he recognized us as locals, he let us in. The store was a mess, clearly having been looted already, but there were still some supplies left. "Take what you need," Mr. Guzman said, "but be fair. We all gotta look out for each other now." We grabbed some canned goods, bottled water, and other non-perishables. I felt guilty about not paying, but Mr. Guzman waved off my concerns. "Money's no good now anyway," he said. "Just remember this when things get back to normal." As we were leaving, a group of rough-looking men approached the store. They didn't look like they were interested in being fair. Mr. Guzman saw them and quickly ushered us out the back. "Go," he said. "I'll handle this. You boys be careful out there." We heard shouting as we hurried away, and I felt a pang of guilt for leaving Mr. Guzman, but Mike pulled me along, insisting we needed to get back to our building. When we got back, we found a group of our neighbors in the lobby, trying to figure out what to do. Sarah, a nurse who lived on the 3rd floor, had taken charge. She was organizing people into teams to check on the elderly and sick in our building. I volunteered to help, grateful for something productive to do. We spent the next few hours going door to door, making sure everyone was okay and sharing what supplies we could. It was during this that we found Mrs. Chen. She was okay but scared and running low on her heart medication. Sarah made a note of it, saying we'd need to organize a trip to the hospital to get supplies. As evening approached, Sarah called a meeting in the lobby. "We need to talk about security," she said. "Things are getting dangerous out there. We need to organize watches, make sure we're safe in here." There was a murmur of agreement. We'd all seen or heard enough to know she was right. We set up a rotation, with pairs of residents taking 2-hour shifts to guard the entrance. I took the first watch with Mike. We sat in the darkened lobby, jumping at every sound from outside. It was during this watch that we saw the first signs of fire in the distance. Plumes of smoke were rising from several directions. "This is really happening, isn't it?" Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and everything will be back to normal." I nodded, understanding exactly how he felt. "Yeah, but we can't think like that. We've got to deal with what's in front of us." As we sat there, I couldn't help but think about my family again. Were they safe? Were they as scared and confused as we were? The not knowing was almost unbearable. Our watch ended without incident and I returned to my apartment. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but as I lay down to sleep, I knew that this was just the beginning. We'd made it through the first 24 hours, but the real challenge was still to come. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of arguing outside. I quickly got dressed and hurried downstairs to find out what was going on. In the lobby, I found a tense standoff between some of our residents and a group of strangers. The strangers were demanding to be let in, saying they had nowhere else to go. Some of our people were sympathetic, but others were adamant about not letting anyone in. The argument was getting heated, and I could see it was about to turn violent. That's when Sarah stepped in. With a calm but firm voice, she managed to de-escalate the situation. She convinced our residents to let the newcomers in, but with strict conditions. They had to share whatever supplies they had and agree to help with the running of our little community. As I watched Sarah handle the situation, I realized how quickly new leaders were emerging in this crisis. The old structures of authority meant nothing now. What mattered was who could keep a cool head and make tough decisions. The incident with the newcomers made us all realize we needed to be better organized. We spent the morning taking inventory of our supplies and skills. We discovered we had a doctor, a few nurses, including Sarah, a mechanic, and even a former military guy among us. We assigned roles based on people's skills. I was put in charge of rationing our food supplies, given my experience with logistics from my office job. It felt strange how quickly we were adapting to this new reality. As the day wore on, we got word from people coming into our building that things in the city were getting worse. There were reports of widespread looting, violence, and fires that were spreading unchecked in some neighborhoods. We knew we couldn't stay in the building forever. We needed more supplies, and we needed to find out what was happening in the rest of the city, maybe even the rest of the country. A small group of us, including me, Sarah, and Mike, decided to venture out to try and gather more information and supplies. We armed ourselves with whatever we could find: baseball bats, kitchen knives, a crowbar. As we stepped out onto the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip would change everything. The city I had lived in for years felt like a foreign, hostile place now. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. We moved cautiously, staying together and keeping our eyes open for any sign of danger. Our first stop was going to be the hospital where Sarah worked. We hoped to find medical supplies and maybe some information about what was happening. As we made our way through the streets, I couldn't help but marvel at how quickly everything had changed. It had only been 36 hours since the blackout, but it felt like we'd stepped into a different world entirely, a world where the rules we'd lived by our whole lives no longer applied. I gripped my makeshift weapon tighter, steeling myself for whatever we might encounter. This was our new reality, and we had to adapt if we wanted to survive. As we turned the corner towards the hospital, I had no idea that what we were about to see would change our understanding of the situation dramatically. As we approached the hospital, the scene that unfolded before us was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The usually bustling emergency room entrance was in chaos. Makeshift tents had been set up in the parking lot, filled with patients on gurneys and improvised beds. Doctors and nurses, looking exhausted and overwhelmed, moved frantically between them. Sarah gasped beside me. "It's worse than I imagined," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We could see that they were working with limited resources. No electronic equipment, just the basics. It was like watching a war zone hospital from another century. We made our way through the crowd, Sarah leading us towards a group of nurses she recognized. They greeted her with relief, quickly filling her in on the situation. The hospital had been running on backup generators, but those had failed hours ago. They were now operating purely on manpower and whatever supplies they could scrounge up. While Sarah talked with her colleagues, Mike and I started gathering whatever medical supplies we could. We found bandages, antiseptics, and some basic medications. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As we were packing our bags, I overheard a conversation between two doctors that made my blood run cold. They were discussing patients who had come in with strange symptoms: severe headaches, nosebleeds, and in some cases, inexplicable burns. They were speculating about radiation poisoning. I pulled Mike aside and told him what I'd heard. His face paled. "You think it's connected to whatever caused the blackout?" he asked. I nodded grimly. "Remember those reports about the solar flare? What if it was more than just an electromagnetic pulse? What if it actually bombarded us with radiation?" The implications were terrifying. Not only were we dealing with a world without technology, but we might also be facing a health crisis unlike anything we'd seen before. We rejoined Sarah, who had managed to convince some of her co-workers to come back with us to our building. They were eager to leave the overwhelmed hospital and help set up a smaller, more manageable clinic. As we made our way back, the street seemed even more dangerous than before. We saw groups of people fighting over food and water. At one point, we had to duck into an alley to avoid a gang that looked ready to rob anyone they came across. When we finally made it back to our building, we were greeted with a mix of relief and anxiety. The newcomers were welcomed, but their presence meant more mouths to feed and more people to protect. We spent the rest of the day setting up a makeshift clinic in one of the empty apartments. Sarah and the other medical professionals got to work organizing the supplies and preparing to treat any ill or injured residents. As night fell, I found myself on watch duty again, this time with one of the new nurses, a guy named Tom. We sat in silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts. "Do you think things will ever go back to normal?" Tom asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I hesitated before answering. "I don't know," I said, honestly, "but I do know we can't sit around waiting for it to happen. We have to adapt to this new reality." Tom nodded, looking out into the darkness. "I keep thinking about my family," he said. "They're in Boston. I have no idea if they're okay, if this affected them too." I understood his pain all too well. The not knowing was perhaps the hardest part of all this. Were our loved ones safe? Was this happening all over the country or even the world? Our watch passed uneventfully, but sleep didn't come easily that night. My mind was racing with everything we'd seen and learned. The possible radiation, the chaos at the hospital, the increasing violence in the streets. It felt like we were balancing on a knife's edge, and one wrong move could send us tumbling into complete anarchy. The next morning I woke to the sound of excited voices. I quickly got dressed and headed down to the lobby to find out what was going on. A group had gathered around an old man I didn't recognize. He was holding what looked like an ancient radio. "It's a shortwave radio," the old man was explaining. "Doesn't need much power and it can pick up signals from far away." My heart leapt. This could be our first real connection to the outside world since everything went dark. We all waited with bated breath as the old man fiddled with the dials. At first there was nothing but static, but then, faintly, we heard a voice. It was broken and hard to make out, but it was definitely a human voice. The old man fine-tuned the frequency and suddenly we could hear it clearly. "This is an emergency broadcast," the voice said. "The continental United States has experienced a catastrophic electromagnetic pulse, believed to be the result of an unprecedented solar flare. All major power grids and electronic systems are down. Citizens are advised to stay in their homes and await further instructions. Emergency services are severely limited. If you are in need of immediate assistance, seek out your local police or fire department." The message repeated, and we all stood in stunned silence. It confirmed what we had suspected, but hearing it made it all the more real. This wasn't just New York. This wasn't even just our country. This was potentially a global event. As the reality of our situation sank in, I could see the mix of emotions on everyone's faces. Fear, certainly, but also a strange sort of relief. At least now we knew what we were dealing with. At least now we had some information to work with. The next few hours were a flurry of activity. We organized a town hall meeting in the lobby where we shared the information from the radio broadcast and discussed our next steps. It was decided that we needed to start thinking long-term. This wasn't going to be over in a few days or even weeks. We needed to start planning for months, maybe even years. Without power or outside help, we divided into teams, each focused on a different aspect of survival. One group would focus on food and water, another on security, another on health and sanitation. I found myself heading up the resource management team, responsible for keeping track of our supplies and coordinating their distribution. As we worked, I couldn't help but marvel at how quickly we were adapting. Just days ago, we were all strangers, concerned only with our own lives and problems. Now we were a community, working together for our collective survival. But even as we organized and planned, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still in the eye of the storm. The real challenges were yet to come. How long could we sustain ourselves in this building? What would happen when our food ran out? And what about the potential radiation poisoning we'd heard about at the hospital? As the day wore on, we got our first taste of the challenges ahead. A fight broke out over water distribution, with one resident accusing another of taking more than their fair share. It was quickly broken up, but it left a tense atmosphere in its wake. Later, as I was doing inventory in our makeshift storeroom, Sarah came to find me. She looked worried. "Jack," she said, her voice low, "we've got a problem. Remember those symptoms the doctors at the hospital were talking about? The headaches and nosebleeds? We're starting to see them here." My stomach dropped. "How many?" I asked. "3 so far," she replied. "All on the upper floors. It could be nothing, but we both knew it probably wasn't nothing. If it was radiation, the people on the higher floors would have been exposed to more of it, and if it was spreading, we were all at risk. We need to keep this quiet for now," I said, "at least until we know more. The last thing we need is a panic." Sarah nodded in agreement, but I could see the fear in her eyes. It was the same fear. I felt myself. We were facing an invisible enemy, one we had no way to fight or protect ourselves from. As night fell on our third day in this new world, I found myself standing on the roof of our building looking out over the darkened city. Fires burned in the distance, sending plumes of smoke into the sky. The stars shone brighter than I'd ever seen them in New York, no longer obscured by light pollution. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. The city that never sleeps had been forced into an unnatural slumber, but as I stood there, I realized that this was just the beginning. The real test was still to come. How would we handle food shortages? What would we do if the water stopped flowing? And how would we protect ourselves not just from the dangers outside, but from the invisible threat that might already be among us? I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the challenges ahead. We had survived the first 72 hours, but I had a feeling that was going going to be the easy part. The real struggle for survival was just beginning. As I turned to head back downstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives had been irrevocably changed. The world we knew was gone, and we were now pioneers in a new, dangerous frontier. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. As the fourth day dawned, the reality of our situation began to sink in. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a grim determination to survive. We had to face the fact that our supplies wouldn't last forever, and we needed to start thinking about long-term solutions. I called a meeting with our core group: Sarah, Mike, Tom, and a few others who had emerged as leaders in our little community. We gathered in what used to be the building's management office, now our makeshift command center. We need to talk. About food, I started, getting right to the point. At our current rate of consumption, we've got maybe a week's worth left. We need to start rationing more strictly and figure out how to get more. Sarah nodded grimly. And water's going to be an issue soon too. The pressure's already dropping. We might only have a few days of running water left. The gravity of our situation hung heavy in the air. We were no longer just weathering a temporary crisis. We were fighting for our long-term survival. Mike, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. I've been thinking, there's a community garden about 3 blocks from here. If we could secure it, maybe start growing some food. It was a good idea, but it came with risks. Venturing outside our building had become increasingly dangerous. The streets were lawless, with gangs of looters roaming freely. But we didn't have much choice. We needed food, and the garden was our best bet. We decided to send a small team to scout the garden. Mike volunteered to lead the mission, and I decided to go with him. We chose 2 others: Lisa, a former cop who had joined our community, and Alex, a young guy who knew the neighborhood well. As we prepared for the mission, Sarah pulled me aside. "Jack, there's something else we need to discuss," she said, her voice low. "Those symptoms I told you about? We're seeing more cases and they're getting worse." My heart sank. We'd been hoping it was just stress or lack of proper nutrition causing the headaches and nosebleeds. But deep down, I think we all knew it was something more sinister. "How many?" I asked. 12 now, Sarah replied, "and 2 of them have developed burns, just like the cases at the hospital." I closed my eyes, trying to process this new information. If it was radiation poisoning, as we feared, we were in even more trouble than we thought. But we couldn't deal with that now. One crisis at a time. "Keep monitoring it," I told Sarah, "but keep it quiet for now. The last thing we need is panic." She nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. We both knew we couldn't keep this secret for long. Our scouting team set out just after noon. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hustle and bustle of New York replaced by an oppressive silence. We moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows, and staying alert for any signs of danger. As we turned onto the street where the community garden was located, we heard voices. Mike held up his hand, signaling us to stop. We crouched behind an abandoned car, peering around it to see what was happening. A group of men were at the garden, harvesting what little had grown. They were armed, guns clearly visible at their hips. My heart sank. We weren't the only ones who had thought of this food source. Lisa tapped my shoulder, pointing to a building across the street. Through a broken window, I could see the barrel of a rifle aimed at the men in the garden. It seemed we had walked into a tense standoff. We retreated quietly, not wanting to get caught in the middle of whatever was about to happen. As we made our way back to our building, a gunshot rang out behind us. We quickened our pace, not looking back. The failed mission was a blow to our morale. When we reported back to the others, I could see the hope drain from their faces. We were running out of options, and everyone knew it. That evening, as I was doing my rounds, I overheard a conversation that chilled me to the bone. 2 of our residents, a middle-aged couple, were discussing leaving. "We can't stay here," the woman was saying. "We're going to starve if we do. We should try to make it to my sister's place upstate." Her husband seemed hesitant. "But it's dangerous out there. We don't even know if the roads are passable." "It's dangerous in here too," she replied. "At least out there, we have a chance." I walked away, troubled by what I'd heard. If people started leaving, it could spark a mass exodus, and I wasn't sure our fragile community could survive that. I shared my concerns with Sarah and Mike. We agreed that we needed to address the community, to be transparent about our situation while also providing hope. We couldn't stop people from leaving if they wanted to, but we could try to convince them that staying together gave us the best chance of survival. The next morning, we called a meeting in the lobby. Nearly everyone attended, their faces a mix of fear, exhaustion, and desperate hope. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I know things are tough," I began, "and I know many of you are scared. We all are, but I want you to know that we're doing everything we can to ensure our survival." I went on to explain our current situation with food and water, not sugarcoating the reality, but also emphasizing the plans we were making. I talked about the failed garden mission, but also about other ideas we were exploring, like rainwater collection and trying to establish contact with other survivor groups. "We're stronger together," I concluded. "Each of us has skills and knowledge that can help us all survive. If we stick together, work together, I believe we can make it through this." There was a moment of silence when I finished speaking. Then slowly people began to nod. I could see a renewed determination in their eyes. For now, at least, it seemed like most were willing to stay and fight for our collective survival. stressful, but our challenges were far from over. That afternoon, Sarah came to me with news that made my blood run cold. "We've got our first serious radiation case," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "A man on the top floor. He's developing severe burns and his white blood cell count is dangerously low." I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself. This was the confirmation we'd been dreading. The radiation poisoning was real, and it was getting worse. "What do we do?" I asked, feeling helpless in the face of this invisible threat. Sarah shook her head. "Without proper medical equipment and supplies, there's not much we can do. We can try to manage the symptoms, make him comfortable." But she didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew the grim reality. Without treatment, radiation poisoning was often fatal. "We need to tell everyone," I said. "They need to know the risk." Sarah nodded in agreement. "We should move everyone to the lower floors too. It might help reduce further exposure." As we prepared to break this news to the community, I couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. How many more challenges could we face? How long could we hold on? But as I looked around at the faces of the people who had become my family in this crisis, I knew we had to keep fighting. We had survived the initial chaos, adapted to a world without power, and formed a community out of strangers. We would face this new threat the same way we had faced everything else together. The next few days were a blur of activity. We moved everyone to the lower floors, turning the upper levels into a quarantine zone for those showing symptoms of radiation poisoning. Sarah and her team worked tirelessly, doing what they could with our limited medical supplies. Food became an even bigger concern. With the community garden out of reach, we had to get creative. We organized small scavenging teams, sending them out to search abandoned apartments and stores. It was dangerous work, but necessary for our survival. I found myself working almost around the clock, coordinating our efforts, mediating disputes, and trying to keep everyone's spirits up. The stress was taking its toll on all of us. Tempers were short, and conflicts broke out over the smallest things. One evening, as I was doing inventory in our dwindling food storage, Mike came to find me. He looked troubled. "Jack, we need to talk," he said, his voice low. "I overheard some of the guys planning a raid on another building. They think it's well stocked and less defended than ours." I felt a chill run down my spine. This was exactly the kind of thing I'd been afraid of. Desperation driving people to turn on others. "Who?" I asked. Mike shook his head. "I don't know all of them, but Jack, if we start attacking other survivors, where does it end? We're supposed to be better than that." I nodded, understanding his concern. We had worked hard to maintain our humanity in the face of this crisis. If we lost that, what would be left? "We'll call a meeting," I decided. "Remind everyone what we stand for. We're not going to survive this by turning into animals." As we prepared for yet another community meeting, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in just a few days. We had gone from a group of strangers to a tight-knit community, facing unimaginable challenges together. But with each new obstacle, I saw the strength and resilience of the human spirit shine through. Yes, we were facing food shortages, the threat of radiation, and the temptation to turn on others for our own survival. But we were also witnessing incredible acts of kindness and sacrifice. People sharing their last bit of food with others, comforting those who were sick or scared, working tirelessly for the good of the community. As I stood before the group once again, ready to address the latest crisis, I felt a glimmer of hope. We had made it this far. Whatever came next, I believed we would face it together. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but as long as we held onto our humanity, there was hope. And in this new world, hope was the most precious resource of all. The meeting I called to address the potential raid on another building was tense. I could see the desperation in people's eyes, the fear that we were running out of options, but I also saw determination, a willingness to hold on to our humanity even in the face of unimaginable challenges. I spoke from the heart, reminding everyone of how far we'd come and what we stood for. "We've survived this long because we've stuck together," I said, "because we've looked out for each other. If we start attacking other survivors, we're no better than the looters and gangs out there. We have to be better than that." To my relief, most people nodded in agreement. Even those who had been considering the raid seemed to realize the dangerous path it would set us on. We agreed to focus our efforts on finding more ethical ways to obtain supplies, but our problems were far from over. The next morning, Sarah came to me with grim news. "We've lost 2 people to radiation sickness," she said, her voice heavy with exhaustion and sorrow, "and we have several more in critical condition." The reality of our situation hit me like a physical blow. We weren't just fighting for survival anymore. We were losing people, friends, neighbors, members of our makeshift family. We held a small memorial service for those we'd lost. It was a somber reminder of the stakes we were facing. As I looked around at the tear-stained faces of our community, I knew we had to do something drastic. We couldn't keep going on like this. That's when Alex, the young guy who had been on our scouting mission, came to me with an idea. "I've been thinking about the water problem," he said. "There's a sporting goods store about 5 blocks from here. They might have water purification tablets, maybe even some camping gear we could use." It was risky, but it was also the first real lead we'd had in days. I gathered a small team: myself, Alex, Lisa, our ex-cop, and Tom, one of the nurses. We armed ourselves as best we could and set out just after dawn. The streets were even more desolate than before. Abandoned cars littered the road and the silence was oppressive. We moved cautiously, always on the lookout for any sign of danger. As we approached the store, Lisa held up her hand, signaling us to stop. "Look," she whispered, pointing to a nearby alley. I peered around the corner and saw a group of people huddled around a small fire, cooking something in a battered pot. For a moment I considered approaching them. Maybe we could trade or join forces, but the wary looks on their faces and the weapons at their sides made me reconsider. We were all survivors now, but that didn't mean we could trust everyone. We made it to the store without incident, but getting inside proved challenging. The security shutters were down, and we had to force our way through a side door. Inside, the store was a mess. It had clearly been looted before, but there was still plenty left. We hit the jackpot with the camping supplies, water purification, tablets, portable stoves, even some freeze-dried food. As we were loading up our backpacks, we heard a noise from the front of the store. Tom, who was keeping watch, whispered urgently, "Someone's trying to get in through the front." We quickly finished packing and slipped out the way we came in. As we rounded the corner of the building, we came face to face with another group of scavengers. For a tense moment, we all froze, sizing each other up. Then one of them spoke. "We don't want any trouble. We're just looking for supplies." I nodded slowly. "Same here. We've got what we need. The store's all yours." They seemed relieved and we parted ways without incident, but the encounter left me shaken. How long before these peaceful encounters turned violent? How long before desperation drove people to extremes? We made it back to our building safely, and our haul was met with cheers of relief. The water purification tablets were a game changer, allowing us to safely use water from less reliable sources. The camping gear gave us new options for cooking and preserving food. But even as we celebrated this small victory, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were living on borrowed time. The radiation sickness was getting worse. Our food supplies were still critically low, and the world outside our walls was becoming more dangerous by the day. That night, as I tried to sleep, I found myself thinking about the future, not just the next day or week, but months from now, a year from now. What would our world look like? Would we still be holed up in this building, scraping by day to day? Or would we have found a way to truly live, not just survive? I was jolted from these thoughts by a commotion in the hallway. I rushed out to find Sarah and Tom struggling with a man I recognized as one of our radiation patients. He was delirious, his skin covered in radiation burns, and he was lashing out wildly. "He's hallucinating," Sarah explained as we managed to subdue him. "The radiation is affecting his brain." As we got the man back to bed, I pulled Sarah aside. "How many more are like this?" I asked. She shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. "Too many. Jack, we're losing this battle. Without proper medical supplies, without a way to treat the radiation poisoning, I don't know how long we can hold on." Her words hit me hard. We'd been so focused on immediate survival, food, water, security, that we'd neglected to think about the long-term effects of the radiation. Even if we solved our other problems, how long before we all succumbed to radiation sickness? The next day, I called another meeting. This time, I didn't have any solutions to offer. Instead, I laid out our situation as honestly as I could. The era, radiation sickness, our dwindling supplies, the increasing dangers outside. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," I said. "We're in trouble, real trouble, and I don't have all the answers. But I believe that together, we can figure this out. We've come this far. We can't give up now." To my surprise, instead of despair, I saw determination on many faces. People started offering ideas. Someone suggested we try to make contact with other survivor groups, pool our resources. Another proposed we look for a way to leave the city entirely, find somewhere less affected by the radiation. As the discussion continued, I felt a renewed sense of hope. Yes, we were facing enormous challenges. Yes, the odds were stacked against us, but we weren't giving up. We were adapting, evolving, finding new ways to face each new challenge. Over the next few days, we put some of these plans into action. We sent out scouting parties to try and make contact with other survivors. We began gathering supplies for a potential move out of the city. We even started improvising radiation detectors using materials we scavenged from electronic stores. But our efforts were interrupted by a new crisis. One evening, as I was discussing plans with Sarah and Mike, we heard gunshots outside. Not the occasional shots we'd grown accustomed to, but sustained gunfire. We rushed to the windows to see what was happening. In the street below, a full-scale battle was raging. Two groups of heavily armed survivors were fighting over territory, their gunfire echoing off the buildings. "We need to lock down," I said, springing into action. "Barricade the doors, get everyone away from the windows." As we scrambled to secure our building, I couldn't help but think that this was what we'd been afraid of all along. The complete breakdown of society. Where might might made right, and survival was the only law. We huddled in the interior rooms of the building, listening to the gunfire outside. Hours passed, and still the fighting continued. I could see the fear on everyone's faces, the realization that no matter how well we'd done so far, we were still at the mercy of forces beyond our control. As dawn broke, the gunfire finally ceased. We cautiously approached the windows to assess the situation. The street below was a war zone. Bodies lay scattered among bullet-riddled cars. The winners of the battle were nowhere to be seen, having moved on to their newly claimed territory. The sight was a stark reminder of how precarious our situation was. We had created a haven of sorts in our building, a place where we still clung to our humanity and our sense of community. But outside our walls, the world had become a brutal, unforgiving place. As we gathered to discuss our next steps, I looked around at the faces of my companions. We were all changed by what we'd been through, hardened by the challenges we'd faced, but I could still see the spark of humanity in their eyes, the determination to not just survive, but to live. I realized then that our greatest strength wasn't our supplies or our defenses. It was our unity, our refusal to give in to despair or to turn on each other. Whatever came next, whether it was radiation sickness, food shortages, or the violence of other survivors, we would face it together. As I stood there, surrounded by these people who had become my family, I felt a strange mix of fear and hope. The world as we knew it was gone, perhaps forever. But out of the ashes of the old world, we were building something new, something resilient, something human. The road ahead would be hard, there was no doubt about that. But as I looked at the determined faces around me, I knew one thing for certain. We weren't giving up. Not now, not ever. Whatever the future held, we would face it head on, together. The aftermath of the street battle left us all shaken. We had grown accustomed to the occasional gunshot or scuffle, but this was different. This was warfare on our doorstep, and it forced us to confront the harsh reality of our situation once again. In the days that followed, we redoubled our efforts to secure our building. We reinforced the barricades at the entrance, set up a more rigorous watch schedule, and began stockpiling weapons. It felt like a betrayal of the peaceful community we had tried to build, but we all understood the necessity. Our food situation was becoming dire. Despite our best efforts at rationing, our supplies were dwindling rapidly. We had to take more risks to find food, sending out scavenging parties more frequently and venturing further into the city. It was during one of these scavenging missions that we had our first real encounter with another group of survivors. I was leading a small team, myself, Lisa, and two others, when we came across a warehouse that looked promising. As we approached, we saw movement inside. We tried to retreat quietly, but they had already spotted us. A voice called out, "We see you out there. Come out slowly with your hands up." I exchanged glances with my team. We were outnumbered and outgunned. Slowly, we emerged from our hiding spot, hands raised. A group of about 10 people emerged from the warehouse, all armed. Their leader, a tall woman with short gray hair, stepped forward. "I'm Ellen," she said. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" I introduced myself and explained our situation. To my surprise, Ellen's expression softened. "We're not looking for trouble," she said. "We're just trying to survive, same as you." What followed was a tense but civil conversation. We learned that Ellen's group had been holed up in the warehouse since the blackout. They had a decent stock of supplies but were running low on medical equipment. An idea began to form in my mind. "What if we work together?" I suggested. "We have medical supplies and personnel. You have food and a secure location. We could help each other." Ellen considered this for a moment, then nodded. "It's worth discussing. Come inside. Let's talk more." That conversation marked a turning point for our community. Over the next few days, we negotiated an alliance with Ellen's group. It wasn't easy. There was distrust on both sides and plenty of details to work out, but the potential benefits were too great to ignore. We agreed to merge our communities, combining our resources and knowledge. It was a logistical challenge to move our people to the warehouse, but it was worth it for the increased security and food supply. However, our problems were far from over. The issue of radiation sickness still loomed large. While the warehouse provided better protection than our old building, we were still seeing new cases every day. Sarah and her medical team worked tirelessly, but without proper equipment and medication, there was only so much they could do. We had to watch helplessly as more of our people fell ill. One evening, as I was discussing our options with Ellen and Sarah, we heard a commotion outside. We rushed to investigate and found a group of our scouts returning with a stranger in tow. The man was in his 50s with wild gray hair and an unkempt beard. He was babbling excitedly, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "I heard your radio broadcasts," he said when we managed to calm him down. "I've been trying to find you for days." This caught us all by surprise. We hadn't been broadcasting anything. Our old shortwave radio had stopped working weeks ago. The man introduced himself as Dr. Alan Reeves, a former physics professor at NYU. "I've been monitoring radio radio frequencies, he explained. There are others out there. Organized groups. They're setting up safe zones, areas with lower radiation levels, and they're working on solutions, ways to mitigate the effects of the EMP and the radiation. His words sent a ripple of excitement through our group. For the first time in weeks, we had news from the outside world, a glimmer of hope that we weren't alone in this struggle. Dr. Reeves told us more about what he had heard. There were rumors of a government remnant operating out of a bunker somewhere in the Midwest. They were coordinating relief efforts, trying to re-establish communication and power grids, but more immediately relevant to us was the news of a safe zone being established in upstate New York. According to Dr. Reeves, they had access to working vehicles and were organizing convoys to bring survivors to the safe zone. This information sparked intense debate within our community. Should we try to make contact with these other groups? Should we risk the dangerous journey to the safe zone? Or should we stay put, continue to build our own community here? Opinions were divided. Some, like Mike, were eager to leave the city behind. We're slowly dying here, he argued. The radiation, the lack of food, the constant danger. This could be our chance to start over somewhere safer. Others, like Ellen, were more cautious. We don't know if we can trust this information, she pointed out. What if it's a trap? Or what if we make the journey only to find that the safe zone doesn't exist? As the debate raged on, I found myself torn. The promise of safety, of a place where we could do more than just survive day to day, was tempting, but I also felt a responsibility to the community we had built here. In the end, we decided on a compromise. We would send out a small scouting party to verify Dr. Reeves's information and make contact with the other groups if possible. If they could confirm the existence of the safe zone and the convoys, we would make plans to leave. I volunteered to lead the scouting mission along with Lisa, Dr. Reeves, and 2 others from Ellen's group. We spent several days preparing, gathering supplies, and planning our route. The night before we were set to leave, I couldn't sleep. I stood on the roof of the warehouse looking out over the darkened city. New York had always been a city of lights, of constant motion and energy. Now it lay silent and still, a shadow of its former self. As I stood there, I thought about everything we had been through since the blackout, the fear, the loss, the constant struggle for survival. But I also thought about the strength we had found in each other, the community we had built from nothing. Whatever happened on this scouting mission, whatever we found out there in the wider world, I knew that this experience had changed us all. We were no longer the people we had been before the blackout. We were survivors, fighters, a family forged in the crucible of this new world. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I made a silent promise to myself and to my community. I would do whatever it took to ensure our survival, to find us a place where we could not just exist, but thrive. With that resolve firmly in mind, I headed back inside to prepare for the journey ahead. As I looked at my fellow scouts, I saw the same determination in their eyes. We were stepping into the unknown, but we were doing it together. As we set out the next morning, the weight of our mission hung heavy on all of us. We weren't just searching for information or supplies this time. We were searching for hope, for a future. And as the warehouse disappeared behind us and we ventured into the uncertain streets of the city, I couldn't help but wonder what challenges lay ahead and whether we would all make it back alive. The scouting mission was fraught with dangers. From the start, the city had become a maze of abandoned vehicles, collapsed buildings, and territories claimed by various survivor groups. We had to navigate carefully, avoiding confrontations whenever possible. On our second day out, we had a close call with a group of hostile survivors. We were scavenging for supplies in an old convenience store when they ambushed us. If it hadn't been for Lisa's quick thinking and combat experience, we might not have made it out. As we caught our breath in a nearby alley, Dr. Reeves turned to me, his eyes wide with fear and awe. "Is it always like this?" he asked. I nodded grimly. "This is our world now," I replied. "Every day is a fight for survival." But it wasn't all bad. We also encountered other survivors who were willing to trade information and supplies. Through these encounters, we began to piece together a broader picture of what was happening in the world beyond our small community. The rumors of government survival and organized relief efforts seemed to be true, at least in part. We heard consistent reports of military convoys moving through certain areas, of attempts to re-establish communication networks. More importantly, we were able to confirm the existence of the safe zone in upstate New York. Multiple sources told us about it, describing it as a large area with significantly lower radiation levels, where survivors were working to rebuild some semblance of normal life. As we gathered this information, I felt a mix of hope and apprehension. The safe zone represented a chance for a better life, away from the constant dangers of the city. But the journey there would be perilous, and there was no guarantee that it would be everything we hoped for. On the 5th day of our mission, we finally made contact with one of the organized groups we had heard about. They called themselves the New Dawn Coalition, and they were operating out of a fortified community college campus. Their leader, a former Army colonel named Harriet Sloan, met with us personally. She confirmed much of what we had heard and provided us with more detailed information about the safe zone and the convoys. "We're organizing another convoy in 2 weeks," she told us. If your people can make it here by then, we can guarantee you safe passage to the zone. It was the opportunity we had been hoping for, but it also presented us with a difficult choice. 2 weeks wasn't much time to move our entire community across the dangerous city landscape. As we prepared to head back to our warehouse, Colonel Sloan pulled me aside. I've seen a lot of survivor groups, she said, her voice low. Not many have managed to hold it together like you have. Your people have a chance, don't waste it. Her words stayed with me as we made the journey back. We had a chance, but it would mean leaving behind the relative safety of our warehouse, risking everything on this promise of a better life. When we finally returned to our community, we were greeted with a mix of joy and anxious anticipation. Everyone wanted to know what we had found, what we had learned about the world beyond our walls. I stood before our assembled community, looking at the faces of the people who had become my family over these past weeks. I saw hope in their eyes, but also fear. They were looking to me for guidance, for a decision that would shape all of our futures. As I began to speak, sharing what we had learned and the opportunity that lay before us, I knew that whatever decision we made, it would be just the beginning of a new chapter in our struggle for survival. The world had changed and we had changed with it. Now we had to decide what our next step would be in this new, dangerous world. The decision to leave our warehouse sanctuary wasn't an easy one. We spent hours debating, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. In the end, the vote was nearly unanimous. We would make the journey to join the convoy to the safe zone. Once the decision was made, we threw ourselves into preparations. We had less than 2 weeks to get ready, and every moment counted. We organized into teams, each focused on a different aspect of the journey. Some were responsible for gathering and rationing supplies, others for mapping out the safest route through the city. Sarah and her medical team worked on preparing for potential health issues during the trip, particularly concerning our radiation-sick members. I found myself working almost around the clock, coordinating between teams, solving disputes, and trying to keep everyone's morale up. The stress was immense, but there was also a palpable sense of hope in the air. For the first time in weeks, we had a goal beyond mere survival. As we prepared, we also kept up our guard. The news of our impending departure had spread, and we noticed increased activity around our warehouse. Other survivor groups were watching us, perhaps wondering if we would leave behind anything valuable. 3 days before we were set to leave, we had our first major setback. One of our scavenging parties was ambushed while out gathering last-minute supplies. 2 of our people were killed, and another was seriously wounded. The loss hit us all hard, a stark reminder of the dangers we faced. I called a meeting that evening, gathering everyone in the main area of the warehouse. As I looked out at the sea of faces, I could see the fear and doubt that the day's events had sown. I know we're all shaken by what happened today, I began. We've lost good people, friends, and I know some of you are wondering if this journey is worth the risk. I paused, letting my words sink in. But I want you to remember why we made this decision. We're not just running from something, we're running towards something. A chance at a real future, not just day-to-day survival. I went on to outline the precautions we were taking, the plans we had in place. I emphasized that while the journey would be dangerous, staying put was no guarantee of safety either. By the end of the meeting, I could see renewed determination in many eyes. We had come too far to turn back now. The night before our departure was tense. Final preparations were made, goodbyes were said to those too sick to travel. We had made the difficult decision to leave behind a small group to care for our most critically ill members, promising to send help once we reached the safe zone. As dawn broke on our departure day, we gathered in the street outside the warehouse. Our group had swelled to nearly 100 people, a mix of our original community and those who had joined us along the way. We had packed as much food and water as we could carry, along with medical supplies and whatever weapons we had managed to scavenge. The first leg of our journey was through familiar territory, but we moved cautiously, aware that the streets we once called home were now potential death traps. We kept to the shadows, avoiding open areas and moving in small coordinated groups. By midday, we had reached the edge of our known territory. From here on out, we would be in uncharted waters. As we paused to rest and regroup, I conferred with my leadership team. Ellen, who had become my right hand in many ways, looked worried. "We're making good time," she said, "but we're burning through our supplies faster than we anticipated. If we don't find a way to restock soon, we'll be in trouble before we reach the rendezvous point." I nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "We'll send out scouting parties," I decided. "Small teams to search for supplies. It's a risk, but one we have to take." As we prepared to move out again, I noticed Dr. Reeves studying his makeshift Geiger counter with a furrowed brow. "Everything okay?" I asked, approaching him. He shook his head slowly. "The radiation levels are fluctuating in strange ways," he explained. "It could be nothing, just pockets of higher concentration, but if it keeps increasing as we move..." He didn't need to finish the thought. We both knew what it could mean. I made a mental note to keep a close eye on the radiation levels as we progressed. The next few days were a blur of constant movement, brief rests, and nerve-wracking encounters. We had several close calls with other survivor groups, some friendly, others decidedly not. Each time we managed to avoid major conflict, but the Constant stress was taking its toll on everyone. On the fourth day of our journey, we hit a major obstacle. The route we had planned took us through a narrow street flanked by high buildings. As we approached, we saw that the street was blocked by a massive pile of rubble from a collapsed building. Going around would add days to our journey, time we couldn't afford. As we stood there trying to figure out our next move, Mike spoke up. "I think I see a way through," he said, pointing to a small opening near the top of the rubble pile. "If we can widen that gap, we might be able to create a path." It was risky. The rubble pile looked unstable, and any attempts to move it could cause a further collapse. But we were running out of options. We spent the next several hours carefully shifting debris, always on alert for any signs of instability. It was backbreaking work, made worse by the constant fear of attack. We set up a perimeter guard, but in this exposed position, we were incredibly vulnerable. Just as we were making real progress, one of our perimeter guards shouted a warning. A group of armed survivors was approaching, at least 20 strong. They didn't look friendly. I quickly organized our defenders, positioning them to cover our workers. As the group approached, their leader stepped forward. He was a burly man with a scar running down one side of his face. "This is our territory," he growled. "You're trespassing." I tried to negotiate, explaining our situation and offering to trade for safe passage, but it quickly became clear that they weren't interested in talking. They wanted our supplies and they were willing to fight for them. What followed was the most intense firefight we'd experienced since the blackout. The air was filled with gunfire and shouts. We had the advantage of cover from the rubble, but they had superior numbers. In the chaos of the battle, I lost track of time. It could have been minutes or hours. I remember the acrid smell of gunpowder, the cries of the wounded, the desperate prayers of those around me. Just when it seemed we might be overwhelmed, we heard a new sound: engines coming from behind us. For a moment, I feared we were about to be caught in a pincer movement, but then I saw the vehicles, military trucks, carrying armed soldiers. The New Dawn coalition had found us. The arrival of the military convoy turned the tide of the battle. The attacking group quickly retreated, leaving us battered but alive. As the dust settled, I did a quick head count. We had lost people, too many people, but we had survived. And now, with the convoy here, we had a real chance of making it to the safe zone. Colonel Sloan approached me, her face grim but respectful. "You've done well to make it this far," she said. "We've been tracking your progress. When we realized you were in trouble, we pushed ahead to meet you." I thanked her, feeling a mix of relief and lingering adrenaline. As we began to organize our group to join the convoy, I couldn't help but reflect on our journey so far. We had faced death, made impossible decisions, lost friends, and found new allies. We had seen the worst of humanity in this crisis, but also the best. And now, as we prepared for the final leg of our journey, I felt a glimmer of real hope. The safe zone was no longer just a distant dream. It was a tangible goal, one within our reach. But as I looked at the tired, battered faces of my companions, I knew our struggles were far from over. We had survived the city, but what challenges awaited us in this new world we were heading towards? As we loaded onto the military trucks, I silently renewed my commitment to our community. Whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. We were no longer just survivors. We were pioneers heading into an uncertain future, but one filled with possibility. The engines roared to life and we began to move. I watched the ruined skyline of New York recede behind us, feeling a complex mix of emotions. We were leaving behind the only world we had known since the blackout, but we were moving towards something new, something that offered more than mere survival. As the city disappeared from view, I turned to face forward towards our future. The road ahead was long and undoubtedly fraught with new dangers, but for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to face whatever came next. We had made it this far. We would make it the rest of the way, together. The journey with the military convoy was unlike anything we had experienced since the blackout. For the first time in weeks, we weren't the ones responsible for our own security. It was a strange feeling, both comforting and unsettling. Colonel Sloan briefed us on the situation as we traveled. The safe zone, she explained, was a large area in upstate New York that had been relatively shielded from the worst effects of the electromagnetic pulse and subsequent radiation. It wasn't paradise, she warned us, but it was a place where we could start rebuilding some semblance of normal life. As we drove through the countryside, I was struck by how different it looked from the city. Nature was already beginning to reclaim abandoned areas. Fields that had once been neatly cultivated were overgrown, and we occasionally saw wildlife wandering across roads that had once been busy highways. Our convoy moved slowly, navigating around abandoned vehicles and debris. Despite the military escort, we remained vigilant. The world was still a dangerous place, and we had learned the hard way not to let our guard down. On the second day of our journey, we encountered our first major obstacle. A massive landslide had blocked the road ahead, the result of neglected infrastructure and recent heavy rains. The military engineers in our convoy estimated it would take at least a day to clear a path. As we set up a temporary camp, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. We were exposed here, vulnerable. I shared my concerns with Colonel Sloan, who nodded grimly. "You're right to be cautious," she said. "We've had reports of a group operating in this area. They've been hitting convoys, taking supplies and weapons. We'll double the watch tonight." That night was tense. I volunteered for watch duty, unable to sleep anyway. As I stood at the perimeter of our camp, my eyes straining in the darkness, I thought about how far we'd come. We were so close to our goal now. The thought of failing at this final hurdle was almost unbearable. Just before dawn it happened. The attack came swiftly and silently. One moment all was quiet. The next, we were surrounded by shadowy figures emerging from the pre-dawn gloom. The military responded quickly, but the attackers had the element of surprise. Gunfire erupted all around us. I found myself back to back with Mike, both of us firing at muzzle flashes in the dim light. The battle was chaotic and confusing. In the mayhem, I lost track of many of our group. I saw Ellen dragging an injured soldier to safety, her face set in grim determination. Sarah was darting between the wounded, doing what she could with our limited medical supplies. Just when it seemed we might be overwhelmed, we heard the sound of approaching helicopters. The attackers, realizing their advantage was lost, began to retreat. As quickly as it had begun, the battle was over. As the sun rose, we were able to assess the damage. We had lost people, both from our group and the military escort. The attackers had managed to steal some of our supplies before fleeing, but we had survived, and the road ahead was nearly clear. Colonel Sloan approached me as we were preparing to move out. "Your people fought well," she said, a note of respect in her voice. "We could use folks like you in the safe zone." I nodded, grateful for the compliment, but too tired to fully appreciate it. As we got back on the road, I couldn't help but wonder what other challenges lay ahead. We were nearing our destination, but I had a feeling our struggles were far from over. The next few days of travel were mercifully uneventful. We passed through small towns and villages, most of them abandoned. Occasionally, we saw signs of other survivors, smoke from campfires, makeshift barriers around buildings, but we didn't stop to investigate. Our goal was tantalizingly close now. On the morning of the 5th day, Colonel Sloan announced that we were nearing the perimeter of the safe zone. As we approached, I saw the first signs of organized civilization we'd encountered since leaving New York. There were manned checkpoints, carefully maintained roads, even the occasional working streetlight powered by solar panels. As we passed through the final checkpoint, a palpable sense of relief swept through our group. We had made it. Against all odds, we had reached the safe zone, but our relief was short-lived. As we entered the main settlement area, it quickly became clear that the safe zone had problems of its own. The streets were crowded with refugees, many looking malnourished and desperate. Makeshift shelters had been set up in every available space. There was order, but it was clearly strained. We were directed to a large gymnasium that had been converted into a processing center for new arrivals. As we filed in, I overheard snatches of conversation from the staff. Phrases like "at capacity" and "resource shortage" kept coming up. A harried-looking official approached our group. "I'm sorry," he began, "but we're experiencing some logistical issues. We can provide temporary housing for some of you, but we don't have space for everyone right now." I felt a surge of anger and frustration. After everything we'd been through, after all the dangers we'd faced to get here, we were being told there might not be room for us. But as I looked around at my exhausted companions, I knew I had to keep it together. They were looking to me for leadership, just as they had back in New York. I took a deep breath and turned back to the official. "We've come a long way," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "We have skills, we're willing to work. Surely there's something we can do to help with your logistical issues." The official looked surprised, then thoughtful. "Actually," he said slowly, "we have been shorthanded in several areas. If your people are willing to pitch in, we might be able to work something out." And just like that, we found ourselves with a new purpose. Over the next few days, our group was split up and assigned to various tasks around the safe zone. Some of us helped with construction, others with food distribution or medical care. It was hard work, but it gave us a sense of purpose. More importantly, it helped us integrate into the community of the safe zone. We were no longer just refugees. We were contributors, valued members of this new society. As the days turned into weeks, we began to settle into a new routine. The safe zone was far from perfect. Resources were always tight, and the threat of outside dangers was ever present. But it was a place where we could begin to rebuild, to think beyond mere survival. One evening, about a month after our arrival, I found myself sitting with Sarah, Mike, and Ellen sharing a simple meal. As we talked and laughed together, I was struck by how far we'd come. We had faced death, made impossible decisions, lost friends, and found new allies. We had seen the worst of humanity in this crisis, but also the best. "You know," Mike said, interrupting my thoughts, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually starting to feel hopeful again." Sarah nodded in agreement. "It's not easy here, but at least we're building something. It feels like we have a future again." As I looked around at these people who had become my family, I felt a surge of pride and determination. We had survived the technological apocalypse, navigated a changed and dangerous world, and found our way to this new beginning. But even as I allowed myself to feel hopeful, I knew our struggles weren't over. The world outside the safe zone was still a dangerous place. Resources were limited, and the threat of conflict, both from outside and within, was ever present. And looming over everything was the ongoing threat of radiation and the long-term effects of the EMP. We had reached the safe zone, but in many ways, our journey was just beginning. We were pioneers in this new world, facing challenges our old lives had never prepared us for. But as I sat there with my friends, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. The technological apocalypse had changed us all. We were no longer the people we had been before the blackout. We were survivors, fighters, a family forged in the crucible of crisis. And whatever the future held, I knew we were ready to face it. As the sun set on another day in the safe zone, I found myself looking to the horizon. Out there, beyond the boundaries of our new home, lay a world forever changed. A world full of dangers, yes, but also full of possibilities. And someday, when we were ready, we would venture out into that world again, not just to survive, but to rebuild, to reclaim what was lost, and to create something new from the ashes of the old world. For now, though, we had found our safe harbor. We had survived the first chaotic days of the apocalypse, made the perilous journey from the heart of New York City, and found a place where we could begin to thrive. It wasn't the end of our story, not by a long shot, but it was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. As I looked around at the bustling activity of the safe zone, at the determination on the faces of those around me, I felt a sense of pride and purpose. We had made it this far. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew we would face them head-on together, because that's what survivors do. That's what we had become. The technological apocalypse had tried to break us, but instead, it had forged us into something stronger. And as we stood on the threshold of this new world, I knew that whatever the future held, we were ready for it. Our journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. As weeks turned into months in the safe zone, we began to settle into a new kind of normal. Our days were filled with work, rebuilding infrastructure, tending to crops, and maintaining the security of our new home. But even as we established routines, we couldn't shake the feeling that our situation was still precarious. The safe zone was a haven, but it wasn't isolated from the problems of the outside world. Refugees continued to arrive, each with harrowing stories of survival. Resources, despite our best efforts at rationing and production, were always stretched thin, and the threat of attack from desperate outsiders or organized raider groups was a constant concern. It was during this time that I found myself taking on more of a leadership role within the community. My experiences in New York and during our journey had given me a unique perspective, and people seemed to look to me for guidance. It was a responsibility I never asked for, but one I couldn't shy away from. One morning, about 3 months after our arrival, I was called to a meeting with the Safe Zones Council. As I entered the makeshift town hall, I could sense the tension in the room. Colonel Sloan was there, along with Dr. Reeves and several other community leaders I'd come to know. "We've got a situation," Colonel Sloan began without preamble. "Our long-range scouts have reported a large group heading our way. At least 100 people, maybe more. They're well armed and moving with purpose." The news sent a chill through the room. We'd dealt with small groups of raiders before, but nothing on this scale. Dr. Reeves spoke up, his voice grave. "There's more. The radiation levels outside the safe zone have been increasing. If this group has been exposed for an extended period, they could be desperate and dangerous." As the council debated our options, I found myself thinking back to our early days in New York, when we were the ones on the outside looking for safety. It was a sobering reminder of how quickly things could change. Finally, Colonel Sloan turned to me. "Jack, you've got experience with both sides of this. What do you think we should do?" I took a deep breath, considering our options. "We can't just turn them away," I said slowly. "If they're as desperate as we think, they'll attack, and we might not be able to hold them off. But we also can't just let them in without precautions. We need to make contact, assess their intentions, and see if we can negotiate." There were nods around the room. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. As the meeting broke up, Colonel Sloan pulled me aside. "I want you on the negotiation team," she said. "Your experience could be valuable." The next few days were a flurry of preparation. We reinforced our defenses, organized our supplies, and put together a team to make contact with the approaching group. As we worked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. Once again, we were facing a threat that could upend everything we'd built. The day of the meeting arrived all too quickly. Our team, consisting of myself, Colonel Sloan, and a few others, set out to a predetermined meeting point a few miles from the safe zone's perimeter. As we waited, I found myself scanning the horizon, my heart pounding with anticipation. When the other group appeared, my breath caught in my throat. They were a ragged bunch, clearly having been through hell, but they moved with a military precision that set alarm bells ringing in my head. Their leader stepped forward, a tall man with a scarred face and cold eyes. "I'm Commander Rollins," he said, his voice rough. "We're looking for sanctuary." As Colonel Sloan began to explain our situation, our limited resources, our concerns about radiation exposure, I studied the group. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Suddenly it hit me. Despite their ragged appearance, their weapons were in excellent condition, too good for a group that had supposedly been struggling to survive. I leaned in close to Colonel Sloan, whispering my observations. Her eyes widened slightly, but she gave no other indication that she'd heard me. Instead, she continued the negotiations, subtly probing for more information. As the conversation went on, it became increasingly clear that this group wasn't what they claimed to be. They were too well organized, too knowledgeable about military tactics and safe zone operations. When Colonel Sloan mentioned our radiation concerns, I saw a flicker of something, amusement, in Commander Rawlins's eyes. Finally, Colonel Sloan called for a break in the negotiations. As we huddled together, she turned to me. "You're right," she said grimly. "They're not refugees. This is a takeover attempt." The realization sent a chill down my spine. We had prepared for attacks, but not for something like this. A well-organized military-style operation. If they got into the safe zone, it could be catastrophic. "We need to warn the others," I said urgently, "if we can get back and prepare our defenses." But even as I spoke, I knew it was too late. Commander Rollins and his group were moving, spreading out in a clearly practiced maneuver. We were surrounded. "Well," Commander Rollins said, his voice cold, "I had hoped to do this the easy way, but I suppose we'll have to do it the hard way instead." What followed was a blur of action. Gunfire erupted around us. I found myself diving for cover, my heart pounding in my ears. Colonel Sloan was shouting orders, trying to organize our small team into some kind of defense. In the chaos, I saw an opportunity, a small gap in their line, a chance to break through and warn the safe zone. Without thinking, I sprinted for it, bullets whizzing past me. I ran like I'd never run before, my lungs burning, my legs aching. Behind me, I could hear shouts and more gunfire, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. The fate of everyone in the safe zone depended on me getting there in time. As I approached the perimeter, I could see confusion on the faces of the guards. I must have looked like a madman, sprinting towards them, covered in dirt and sweat. "We're under attack," I managed to gasp out. "Armed group military training. They're coming." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Alarms were sounded. Defenses were mobilized. I found myself in the thick of it, helping to coordinate our response even as I worried about the fate of Colonel Sloan and the others who had been with us. The attack, when it came, was brutal. Commander Rollins and his forces hit us hard, using tactics that spoke of extensive military training. But we had one advantage they hadn't counted on: the determination of people fighting for their home, their future. The battle raged for hours. I saw acts of incredible bravery. Sarah working tirelessly to treat the wounded under fire. Mike leading a daring counterattack that turned the tide at a crucial moment. And through it all, the people of the safe zone fought with a fierce determination that would have made me proud if I'd had time to think about it. As dawn broke, it became clear that we had held them off. Commander Rollins and what was left of his force retreated, leaving us battered but unbroken. In the aftermath, as we tended to our wounded and assessed the damage, I found myself reflecting on how quickly things had changed. Just yesterday, we had been focused on building, on creating a new life. Now we were once again in survival mode. But as I looked around at the determined faces of my fellow survivors, I realized something important. We had faced this threat and overcome it. We had protected our home, our future, and in doing so, we had grown stronger. The safe zone would recover from this attack. We would rebuild what was damaged, bury our dead, and move forward, but we would do so with a new understanding of the world we were living in and the challenges we still faced. As I helped with the cleanup efforts, my mind was already turning to the future. We needed better defenses, better intelligence about the world beyond our borders. We needed to be prepared for threats like Commander Rollins while still remaining open to those genuinely in need of help. It was a difficult balance, but I believed we could find it. We had survived the technological apocalypse, made it through the dangerous journey from New York, and now defended our new home against a military assault. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew we would face them together. As the sun set on that long, difficult day, I found myself standing on the walls of the safe zone, looking out at the world beyond. It was still a dangerous place, full of threats, both seen and unseen, but it was also a world of possibilities, a world we were slowly but surely learning to navigate. We had survived the first 48 hours of the technological apocalypse, and every hour since then, we had faced challenges challenges we never could have imagined in our old lives, and we had overcome them. Whatever the future held, I knew one thing for certain: we were ready for it. As I turned to head back into the safe zone, to rejoin the community that had become my family, I felt a sense of determination wash over me. We had fought for this place, this future, and we would continue to fight for it, no matter what challenges lay ahead, because that's what survivors do. That's what we had become. In the months following Commander Rawlins' attack, life in the safe zone underwent significant changes. We had learned a harsh lesson about the dangers that still existed in the world, and we were determined not to be caught off guard again. Our defenses were strengthened, with new walls built and a more comprehensive early warning system put in place. We established regular patrols beyond our borders, keeping an eye out for any potential threats. But perhaps the most significant change was in our mindset. We were no longer just survivors seeking refuge. We had become protectors of our new home. I found myself at the center of many of these changes. My role in the community had evolved from simply being a leader to becoming something of a strategist. People looked to me not just for day-to-day guidance, but for long-term planning and decision-making. It was a responsibility that weighed heavily on me. Every decision could have life or death consequences, and the memory of those we'd lost, both in New York and during the attack, was a constant reminder of the stakes we faced. One morning, about 6 months after the attack, I was called to an emergency council meeting. As I entered the room, I could sense the tension in the air. Colonel Sloan, who had thankfully survived the encounter with Rawlins, stood at the head of the table, her face grim. "We've received some disturbing news," she began without preamble. "Our long-range scouts have reported increased activity to the south. It looks like several large groups are on the move, all heading in our general direction." The room erupted in murmurs of concern. We had dealt with refugee groups before, but never on this scale. Dr. Reeves spoke up, his voice tense. "There's more. The radiation levels in that area have been spiking. If these groups are fleeing from that, they could be desperate and potentially very sick." The implications were clear. We were facing a potential influx of refugees, many of whom might be suffering from radiation sickness. Our resources were already stretched thin. How could we possibly cope with this? As the council debated our options, my mind raced. We couldn't simply turn these people away, but accepting them all could overwhelm our community. And if they were indeed sick, it could introduce a health crisis we weren't equipped to handle. Finally, Colonel Sloan turned to me. "Jack, what do you think? You've been in their shoes. What would you do?" I took a deep breath, considering our options. "We need more information," I said slowly. "We can't make a decision based on rumors and distant observations. I think we need to send out a team to make contact, assess the situation firsthand." There were nods around the table. It was a risky plan, but it was better than sitting and waiting for the problem to come to us. "I'll lead the team," I volunteered. I saw concern flash across several faces, but I knew it had to be me. I had the experience, and I knew what to look for. The next few days were a flurry of preparation. We gathered supplies, prepared our vehicles, and briefed the team on what to expect. As we worked, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Something about this situation felt different, more ominous than our previous challenges. The morning of our departure arrived all too quickly. As we prepared to leave, Sarah approached me, her face etched with worry. "Be careful out there," she said, handing me a small medical kit. "And Jack, come back to us." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. As I climbed into the lead vehicle, I took one last look at the safe zone, at the home we had built. Whatever we found out there, I swore to myself that I would do whatever it took to protect this place and these people. Our journey south was tense and uneventful. The landscape was eerily empty, with only the occasional sign of human habitation, long since abandoned. As we traveled, we kept a close eye on our radiation detectors, watching with growing concern as the levels slowly but steadily increased. On the third day, we saw the first signs of the groups we were looking for. In the distance, we could make out a large camp sprawling across what had once been a small town. As we approached, we could see figures moving about, hundreds of them. We parked our vehicles at a safe distance and approached on foot, flags of truce held high. As we got closer, the true scale of the situation became clear. This wasn't just a large group, it was an exodus. Thousands of people from all walks of life gathered together in a makeshift camp. A group of leaders met us at the edge of the camp. They were a diverse bunch, civilians mixed with what looked like former military and government officials. Their spokesperson, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, introduced herself as Dr. Elena Rossi. "We're glad you've come," she said, her voice tired but relieved. "We've been hoping to make contact with other organized groups." Over the next few hours, Dr. Rossi and the others filled us in on their situation. They were fleeing from a massive radiation zone to the south, created by the meltdown of several nuclear power plants that had failed during the initial EMP. The radiation was spreading, forcing more and more people to flee northward. "We've got scientists, doctors, engineers," Dr. Rossi explained. "People with skills that could be valuable, but we've also got thousands of civilians, many of them sick or elderly. We need a safe place, somewhere to rebuild." As I listened, my heart sank. The scale of their need was far beyond anything our safe zone could handle, but at the same time I could see the potential. These people had skills we desperately desperately needed, knowledge that could help us not just survive, but thrive. As we prepared to return to the safe zone with our report, Dr. Rossi pulled me aside. "There's something else you should know," she said, her voice low. "We've been hearing rumors about groups to the west, organized and well-armed. They're not looking to rebuild, they're looking to conquer." The news sent a chill down my spine. It was like Commander Rawlins all over again, but on a much larger scale. As we began our journey back, my mind was racing. We had to find a way to help these refugees, to incorporate their skills and knowledge into our community. But we also had to prepare for this new threat. The trip back to the safe zone seemed to take forever. When we finally arrived, I immediately called a council meeting to report our findings. The room was silent as I laid out everything we had learned, the massive challenge represented by the refugee group and the looming threat from the west. As the implications sank in, I could see the mix of emotions on everyone's faces. Fear, certainly, but also determination. We had faced challenges before and we had overcome them. This was just another obstacle to be faced. Over the next few weeks, we worked tirelessly to prepare. We expanded our walls, increasing the safe zone's capacity. We sent teams to scout for additional locations that could be fortified and developed, and we began to prepare our defenses, knowing that sooner or later we would likely face another attack. When the refugees began to arrive, it was both inspiring and overwhelming. Watching thousands of people stream into our community, grateful for safety but carrying the weight of their experiences, was a powerful reminder of why we were fighting so hard to build this place. Integrating them into our community was a challenge, but also an opportunity. Their skills and knowledge accelerated our development in ways I could never have imagined. We were able to restart small-scale manufacturing, improve our agricultural yields, and even begin to rebuild some of the technology we had lost. But even as we grew and developed, the threat from the west loomed large. Our scouts brought back increasingly worrying reports of a large, militarized group that was slowly but surely making its way towards us. It seemed that a confrontation was inevitable. As I stood on the walls of our expanded safe zone one evening, looking out at the setting sun, I found myself reflecting on how far we had come. From those first chaotic hours in New York, through our dangerous journey, to building this community, we had faced challenge after challenge, and each time we had emerged stronger. I thought about all the people who were now counting on us, not just to survive, but to build a real future. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but so was the sense of purpose it gave me. As I turned to head back into the community, I saw Sarah approaching. She had been working tirelessly to manage the health needs of our expanded population, and the strain showed on her face. But there was also a determination there, a fierce commitment to our shared future. "How are you holding up?" she asked as she reached me. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "It's overwhelming sometimes," I admitted. "The scale of what we're dealing with, the number of lives at stake. But then I look around at what we've built, at how far we've come, and I know we can handle whatever comes next." Sarah nodded, a small smile on her face. "We've been through a lot together, haven't we? From those first days in the office building to now. Sometimes I can hardly believe it's the same world." As we stood there, looking out over our community, I felt a renewed sense of determination. Yes, we faced enormous challenges. The threat from the West, the ongoing struggle with radiation, the constant need for resources, all of these were daunting obstacles, but we had survived the technological apocalypse. We had made it through those first terrifying hours and days. We had traveled across a dangerous, changed world and built something meaningful. Whatever came next, I knew we would face it the same way we had faced everything else. Together, the sun dipped below the horizon, marking the end of another day in our new world. But as the darkness fell, I didn't feel fear. Instead, I felt hope. Hope for our future. Hope for the world we were building. Because despite everything we had been through, everything we had lost, we had never lost the most important thing, our humanity. As Sarah and I turned to head back into the heart of our community, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. Yes, there were challenges ahead. Yes, there would be difficult times, but we were ready. We were survivors, builders, protectors, and whatever the future held, we would face it head on, together.